We often believe that history is carved in stone, a set of immutable facts handed down by those who witness them. But history is more often written in ink, and ink can be spilled, smeared, or, in the case of the greatest intelligence theft of the 20th century, deliberately overwritten by a man whose ambition outweighed his honor. If you were to open a newspaper in the mid-1940s, you would have seen one face dominating the headlines in the war against espionage: Edgar Hoover. The director of the FBI was painted as the tireless guardian of the Western Hemisphere, the genius G-man who personally dismantled the Nazi spy rings threatening to turn South America into a launch pad for the Third Reich. The official narrative was clean, heroic, and absolute. It told the American public that the FBI, through superior detective work and cunning, had intercepted the secret communications of the Axis powers and saved the nation from infiltration. But this narrative was a forgery. It was a carefully constructed myth designed to elevate one man's ego at the expense of the truth. While the world cheered for Hoover, the real architect of that victory was being systematically erased from the record. The FBI did not crack the Nazi codes in South America. In fact, Hoover's agents were notoriously inept at cryptanalysis, often stumbling in the dark while claiming to see the light. The intelligence that fueled Hoover's press conferences, the precise locations of German clandestine radio stations, and the identities of the saboteurs, none of this originated from the Bureau. It was stolen. It was physically confiscated from a small, underfunded, and secret Coast Guard unit that operated in the shadows, far from the flashbulbs of the press. This betrayal wasn't just a bureaucratic oversight, it was an act of aggressive appropriation. Hoover, obsessed with maintaining an image of omnipotence, could not abide the idea that a rival agency, let alone a civilian unit, held the keys to national security. When the intercepts were decoded and the hard work was done, FBI agents would swoop in, acting on orders to seize the transcripts. They didn't just take the information, they rebranded it. They stamped FBI on documents they hadn't deciphered and filed them away as their own achievements. It was a hostile takeover of intellectual property on a governmental scale. The agents who performed the raids were celebrated as heroes, their photos splashed across magazines, while the true mastermind, the person who had actually stared into the chaos of intercepted radio waves and found the order within, was pushed into the background. The tragedy of this block in history is not just that credit was stolen, but that the thief was trusted so implicitly. Hoover leveraged these stolen victories to consolidate power, building the FBI into a monolith that no president dared to challenge. He built a legend on a foundation of lies, convincing the world that the Bureau was the sole shield against tyranny. Meanwhile, the true shield, a brilliant mind working in obscurity, was forced to watch in silence as her life's work was co-opted to polish the badge of a man who cared more for his reputation than for the truth. The world applauded the puppet master, completely unaware of the woman whose strings he had cut to dance alone on the stage. This is how the lie began, with a stamp, a file cabinet, and a director who decided that history belonged to the loudest voice in the room, not the sharpest mind. In an era that was rapidly falling in love with machines, where the hum of early computing and the mechanical clatter of the Enigma defined the cutting edge of warfare, the greatest weapon against the Third Reich spies in the Americas was surprisingly analog. It was not a towering mainframe or a team of mathematicians armed with slide rules. It was a woman, a desk, and a simple yellow pencil. Her name was Elizebeth Friedman, and while the world has spent decades celebrating the men of Bletchley Park, Elizabeth was fighting a lonely, cerebral war from a cramped office in Washington, D.C., armed with nothing but her intuition and a stack of graph paper. Elizabeth was not a soldier. She was a poet, a scholar of Shakespeare, a woman who had stumbled into the world of codes through a love of literature. But she possessed a mind that saw patterns where others saw only noise. While her male counterparts were obsessed with building machines to defeat machines, Elizabeth understood that codes were human constructs, flawed by the habits and psychological tics of their creators. She didn't just break ciphers, she psychoanalyzed them. She spent her days and nights staring at thousands of random letters, jumbled streams of gibberish intercepted from clandestine radio towers in Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. To the untrained eye, it was static. To Elizabeth, it was a conversation waiting to be heard. Her task was monumental. The Nazi spy network in South America, known as Operation Sato, was vast and sophisticated. Led by the elusive spy master Johannes Siegfried Becker, it was tasked with guiding U-boats to Allied convoys and preparing the groundwork for a potential invasion of the Americas. The stakes were existential. A single missed message could mean a torpedo in the hull of a transport ship. And yet Elizabeth dismantled this network letter by letter. She worked until her eyes burned and her hand cramped, identifying the fists, the unique typing rhythms of individual German radio operators. She built a mental map of the entire enemy infrastructure, linking aliases to real names and safe houses to radio frequencies. There is a profound, quiet heroism in the image of Elizabeth Friedman at her desk. She wasn't kicking down doors, she was dissolving the enemy's secrecy with the tip of her pencil. One of her most spectacular feats involved the Queen Mary, a massive ocean liner converted to carry thousands of Allied troops. The Nazis had located it. The U-boats were converging, ready to turn the ship into a tomb. It was Elizabeth who intercepted the traffic, broke the code in real time, and provided the intelligence that allowed the Queen Mary to alter its course, slipping past the wolf pack in the dark Atlantic. 8,000 lives were saved not by a torpedo or a fighter plane, but by a woman analyzing frequency tables on a piece of paper. She proved that the human mind was the ultimate cryptoanalytic engine. She didn't need the brute force of a bomb machine. She used the finesse of a virtuoso. She saw the architecture of the Nazi cipher systems, recognized their mistakes, and exploited them with ruthless efficiency. She was the ghost in their machine, the unseen listener who turned their own communications against them. And she did it all while battling the skepticism of military men who couldn't fathom that a civilian woman, a mother, a poet, held the fate of their fleets in her hands. She was the secret weapon the military didn't want to admit they needed, performing miracles of logic that would remain classified, buried under the weight of secrecy and gender bias for over half a century. The cruelest irony of Elizabeth Friedman's life was not that she went unrecognized, but that she was actively silenced by the very government she served. By the mid-1940s, Elizabeth had achieved what the entire intelligence apparatus of the United States had struggled to do. She had the Nazi spy ring in South America completely compromised. She was reading their mail before they did. She knew their plans, their fears, and their locations. From a strategic standpoint, she held a royal flush. The smart play, the play Elizabeth advocated for, was to keep the game going. She wanted to continue monitoring the spies, feeding them disinformation, and using them as unwitting pawns to mislead Berlin. It was a classic counterintelligence strategy that could have shortened the war. But JEdgarHoover had no patience for the long game. He didn't want intelligence, he wanted headlines. He wanted the glory of the bust. Ignoring the advice of the cryptanalysts, Hoover ordered his agents to move in. The FBI launched a series of high-profile raids across South America. It was a publicity stunt disguised as a police action. While the newspapers heralded the smashing of the spy rings, the reality was a disaster. The premature raids tipped off the Nazis. They realized their codes were broken. They went dark, changed their ciphers, and the stream of intelligence that Elizabeth had painstakingly tapped into dried up instantly. Hoover had traded a goldmine of information for a momentary spotlight. The betrayal did not end there. To protect his manufactured legacy, Hoover and the military establishment needed to ensure that no one asked who had actually done the work. Elizabeth was not merely ignored, she was gagged. The Navy forced her to sign a draconian oath of silence, forbidding her from ever speaking about her role in the war. She was told that her work was classified, a convenient label that protected national security in theory, but in practice protected Edgar Hoover's reputation. She watched as Hoover wrote books like The FBI in Peace and War, in which he took personal credit for the very victories she had engineered. She saw movies and radio dramas lionizing the G-men for feats she had performed with a pencil in a basement. Elizebeth Friedman spent the rest of her life in the shadow of the man who stole her thunder. She never gave interviews. She never wrote a memoir to correct the record. She sorted her husband's papers, curated his legacy as the father of the NSA, and allowed her own story to gather dust in the archives. She died in 1980, a quiet, elderly woman whose obituary mentioned nothing of the thousands of sailors she saved or the Nazi networks she destroyed. It wasn't until 2008, 60 years after the war and nearly 30 years after her death, that the files were finally declassified. Researchers opened the dusty boxes and found the truth stamped over with FBI markings. They found the worksheets, the graph paper, and the undeniable proof that Elizebeth Friedman was the giant upon whose shoulders the FBI had stood. Today, we reclaim her name from the footnotes. We remember her not just as a codebreaker, but as a casualty of an era that preferred a male hero to a female genius. She was the woman who caught spies with a pencil, only to have her voice stolen by the state. But history has a way of correcting itself, and though she is out of time, her mind finally speaks to us, loud and clear, demanding the honor she was owed all along.